All right, let's dive in to some photo editing. Let's look at 3 ways we can make our subject pop within Lightroom Classic. This also works in other photo editing software, so don't you worry about that if you're using something else. It's Tutorial Tuesdays. Welcome back to Tutorial Tuesday, where each and every Tuesday we bring you a brand new, fresh photography tutorial. Let's just dive straight into it this week. Let's forego the waffling on about whatever it is. Let's just get into it. So we're going to start off with this photo here. Normally when we look at kind of how we can make our subjects pop, which we have looked at in the past, we are talking mostly about photos like this, right? Or like this, where it's a very obvious, usually a photo of a person, but that's not always the case. Sometimes we have a photo like this, where we want to make our subject pop a little bit more. Now here, of course, we've got this nice, actually, I've got to be honest, the colors in this are very pleasing, I think. And we've got this nice kind of photo. We've got these people out here on, I guess, what you'd call paddle boards. I don't know, but it looks good, right? And we want to make them pop a little bit more in the scene. And there's a few ways we might go about that, but we don't want to be too kind of aggressive with the techniques that we use, because it'll appear really obvious to the eye and it's just a bit over edited, right? So we could leave it as is, but we can definitely do something to enhance this a little bit. So what we do in this situation, I think, is probably play around a little bit with the exposure. And we're going to use masks to do it. So we're going to come up here to the masking panel. We're going to go ahead and use a radial gradient. And what I'm going to do is immediately just bring something on like this, right? Nothing too crazy. Maybe even just bring it out super wide. So we're kind of brightening. So we bring that exposure up a little bit, brightening this kind of middle part of the image, just to kind of draw the viewer's eye into where our subject actually is here. And then in addition to that, we might darken some other areas to really push our viewer's eye where we want it to go, i.e. to our subject. So we can go create new mask. Let's go linear gradient. Let's bring one up from the bottom. So it's nice and sort of soft, nice and sort of feathered there. We're just going to darken that down a little bit. The exposure looks pretty natural, actually. And then the same again on the sky. Something like this. Nothing too crazy. We just want to, I'm just going to bring the blacks down a little bit as well. And look at that. Immediately makes a huge difference. Now we can look at that without the mask. If we turn that off here by pressing and holding on this little eye icon on the masking panel, that was before. So this is before we applied any of these masks, and this is now. You can see how it still looks pretty natural, and you could dial it back a bit if you wanted to go even more kind of subtle with it. But we're now just pushing the viewer to where we want them to be looking, which is actually where our subject is. So we're really making them pop in the scene. We've got nice amounts of contrast there as well by making it a little bit brighter, because our subjects there are almost silhouetted, really. So I think it works really well. Light is certainly one way we can do this. So brightening the area we want our viewer to be looking at, brightening our subject to make them pop in the scene, and actually darkening some other areas as well. A bit of both goes quite a long way. This is another photo where I have already done that to this photo. So I've already brightened our subject and I've darkened the background a little bit. And if I was to turn the masking off here, you can see this is what it looked like before I applied the masks. This is what it looked like with the mask. So I won't do a full breakdown of this photo, but it's basically the same kind of concept, right? Brighten the subject and darken some areas around our subject to really guide our viewer's eye. Now, it's not always light that we want to use, and certainly the exposure values that we want to use to actually influence how our subject is popping in the scene. This photo, for example, is going to work really well with a different method, and that's basically using color a little bit. Now, I don't like to use this all the time, because sometimes it can feel a little bit too edited, right? A little bit too stylized. But essentially, we're going to just really break this down by desaturating the background from our subject. It's going to allow our subject to really pop in the scene. Now, this works particularly well in this photo because it's a reasonably monotone feeling image apart from our subject. And I think that the background being desaturated won't immediately pull focus to the desaturated background, if you like, which it would if there was obvious color that had been pulled out of the scene. Whereas this photo, I think it's actually going to look pretty natural, but allow our subject to really pop in the photo. So we can do this really easily. Come up to the masking panel. We're going to go create new mask. We're just going to hit select background. Lightroom's going to work that out really fast, actually. That was great. And we can just bring the saturation down. We don't have to go crazy, but I'm going to bring it down pretty far. Maybe not all the way to -100, right? That might be a bit intense. But if we go to something like -70, 75, something like that, let's go around there. There we go. That actually, I think, looks really nice. We've got this nice monotone background. There's still a hint of color there, so it doesn't look kind of too much. But our subject is certainly popping within the photo because of the color still left in our subject. That can be a great way of doing this. We aren't going to use the exposure values that we used before because, you know, we've got this bright window in the background, but I think that this works really well and just allows our subject to shine through, but in a different way. So we've looked at exposure as a way of making our subject pop. We've looked at color as a way of making our subject pop. With this same photo, we could also look at contrast, right? So sometimes actually bringing that contrast down on the background can work pretty well as well. If we were to bring the contrast down here, you can see that our subject still remains nice and kind of high contrast. So you get another element of a kind of pop to the image and to our subject there. Doesn't work with every image. These are ones I like to use a little bit more sparingly, whereas the exposure one I'll use a lot, to be honest with you. But it's certainly something that's worth playing around with, because with the right photo, it can look really good. Lastly, let's look at the tool that we've mentioned in other videos, but it's definitely worth mentioning here as well, because it is such a useful tool when you are trying to get a little bit more pop from your subject. We're going to look at the lens blur tool. So this photo is a great one to use for this kind of thing, right? It works best when it's enhancing a shallow depth of field that already exists in the image. We've got a full video explaining how to use this tool kind of in depth. But essentially on the right-hand side here in Lightroom Classic, we're going to come all the way down to lens blur. And all we have to do is click apply. And Lightroom's going to work out a depth map of the image. So it can work out kind of the depth of field, and it can enhance that blur. Now it can also do a pretty good job of creating blur by itself, but it works best when it's enhancing blur that already exists, right? So we've got a few different sliders to control it. Blur amount, I'll tend to leave it at about 50, right? Because Lightroom's done a really good job. I mean, right here, if we click and hold on this eye icon on the lens blur panel, we can see this is what it looked like before, this is what it looks like after. If we were to up that a little bit, 66, for example, before, after, it works really well, just giving us a little bit more separation between our subject and our background. And you know, it's a very easy tool to just use. All we've had to do there is turn it on. Lightroom's done the work for us. And I think it looks really good, right? It's pretty natural looking. And especially, like I say, if you use it on an image that already has some level of depth of field blur, right? Lightroom's just going to work better at being able to kind of get the most out of that and enhance that a little bit. So you've got 3 ways of really making your subject pop there that we've looked at. Using exposure to brighten your subject to guide the viewer's eye and darken elements of the background to really shape where your viewer is looking at the image towards your subject, right? Using contrast and saturation to really make your subject pop and stand out in the image. Not always going to work, but when it does, it can be a really powerful tool. And then, of course, the lens blur tool works fantastically, especially with slightly longer focal lengths. I find that Lightroom just works better with slightly longer focal lengths when it comes to the lens blur. And I think that's probably because those focal lengths are more naturally going to have some blur to the background, some separation from subject and background. I think Lightroom is able to pick up on that. It does a really good job of working out a depth map of the image and then applying that depth of field effect. 3 super useful techniques, one of which I use all the time, the exposure. The lens blur tool I'll use quite a lot actually for especially portraiture work if I don't have a fast aperture lens. And then the saturation of the contrast method, I'll use a bit more sparingly, but when it does work, it can work really, really well. Anything else that you use to separate your subject from your background that we haven't touched on, we haven't even mentioned here, I'd be super interested to know, because I think we can all learn from each other. We've got a great community here, and it's always super fun to read your comments. And also, is there anything you'd like to see in a future Tutorial Tuesday? I've got a good number of them planned out, good number lined up, but I'm always keen to make sure I'm making the ones that you guys want to see. So let me know in the comments if there's something specific you would like to see in a future Tutorial Tuesday. Otherwise, full list of all the kit we use for these photos, for these videos, all this stuff down in the description. Don't forget to like and subscribe as well, because there's new stuff all the time. I will, of course, see you in the next video. But until then, as always, thanks for watching.